Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hi, folks, and welcome to the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Ainslie Caswell, and today I decided to tackle the topic of sex parties. So we're going to be discussing the basics of what exactly are these things, the general do's and don'ts, and tips for how to get through maybe your first or many sex parties, and some myths about sex parties, because I'm sure there are many. I thought this was a good topic to discuss, not just because I think it's something that is elusive and a thing that people have questions about if you're unfamiliar with them, but I've been to a few, and I've been to a few as a vendor, because, as I've mentioned before, I used to sell sex toys and other intimate products. And while I was doing that, I got invited into a circle that met on a regular basis, and I attended several meetups. And so I got to see exactly how that went down, at least in that type of arena. There's many different types of sex parties, or you might be able to call them orgies, although I think orgy falls into a different category. So for the purposes of this type of event, I'll refer to them as sex parties because that seems to be the agreed upon term for what we're discussing. As we have done in the past, let's start with very clinical and boring dictionary-type definitions. An orgy is a type of group sex that involves more than two people that are involved in a sexual activity that has some level of cross-couple contact. And the people involved are freely engaging in that activity, and it is open and unrestrained. A sex party, on the other hand, is more loosely defined as an event that people go to engage in sexual activity with one another. So think of it like the act versus the event. The orgy is the sexual act. The sex party is the event that the act takes place at. However, an orgy doesn't necessarily need to take place at the sex party. The sex party can contain many sexual acts. One of them may be an orgy. It may not be. But that's essentially the difference between the two. A sex party and an orgy are not synonymous with one another. So they really can't be used interchangeably. So just know that that's the difference between the two in terms of terminology and definition. Wasn't that fun and educational? That's what I'm here for, folks. So what's your next question? It might be, where the heck do these take place? Well, the ones that I was attending took place in hotels. It was basically anywhere that they could get a multi-room hotel suite. The other types of things that they seemed to look for were suites that had common rooms, multiple bedrooms, of course, and a multiple bathroom situation was highly appealing to them. There were other parties that I was made aware of and even invited to, but it never materialized, that were taking place at private homes. I'm unsure of the commonality or exclusivity of one type versus the other. I do know that the event that seemed to be getting set up at the person's private home, they seem to be extra concerned about security. And in the instances where I've heard about people hosting at their home, it seems to be restricted to people that they know personally, which I think gets a bit stickier because when you run into these types of lifestyles, a lot of people tend to not include people that they know in their personal lives. So if you do engage in this kind of lifestyle and you do choose to share it with people that you know in your real life, you sort of have to have a perfect set of circumstances for that to be able to fall into place. And I really honestly don't know how many people have that. You would need to have a home and a property in order to accommodate the type of event you want to host. You would need to have a circle of friends that are interested in engaging in the type of things that you want to engage in, who are also interested in keeping the same types of secrets and OPSEC that you're interested in keeping. You would need to have the funding to have the event in the first place. You would need to have the time and resources to be able to plan everything. And this is also assuming that the people that you're inviting all fit into the mold of, again, what everyone's looking for. These are just a few reasons that a lot of people end up going into these social clubs or online communities to find like-minded people that want the same things they want. Some of these things involve the older term of swinging, which a lot of people don't seem to use anymore. It's become the term of poly now because 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was the word swinging. And now it's the same practice, but it's just going by a different name. Even if you do participate in these types of activities with your actual friends and people that you know for real, a lot of people are still not comfortable doing these things in their actual homes. So you can do both. You can still have personal friends who are knowledgeable of what you do in your intimate life, and you can do it with them, but you also can seek out these communities online or on these email lists and then go to these outside places, but you can do it with your friends if that's something that you are comfortable with and you want to share with them. Your next question after, where does this happen, might be, how do I find all of this stuff? Well, I still have that question, even though I used to physically be present at some of these parties. The party circle that I was attending, they had hunted me on my party salesperson page. All of a sudden, just out of nowhere, I got an email from some orchestrator saying, hey, we had this idea that it might be cool if we had somebody like you at our events. So I don't know if you're good with it. I can give you info. I'll tell you what goes on. You could try it out. No commitment. If you think that's cool, you can show up. And that's exactly what it was. They gave me all the info that I wanted. There was no commitment. They also didn't pay me to be there, but I was able to sell and do basically whatever I wanted. And they also said that they would protect me if anybody gave me a hard time. And they did that too. And we can talk about that when we get to things like do's and don'ts and myths about parties. But I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and speculate that you, listener, are not a dildo vendor, and a sex party solicitor is not going to randomly email you and invite you to a sex party. So you're probably going to have to go in search of one if you're looking to attend. So where do you go? I'm not the best person to give you answers, so I did have to do advanced research, which I do for all of my episodes. What are you talking about? So my instincts told me to tell you to go to what I like to call the origins of the internet, which is places like Reddit or Tumblr, places where everyone gets all of the, basically places where memes are created. That was what I wanted to tell you. Because honestly, it's some of those places, those are some of the only places on the internet left where free speech in regards to sexual activity is less banned than other places. If you try to have sexual discussions about almost anything or sexual entertainment of any kind on a lot of other types of platforms, it'll just get struck down or banned, especially if it involves people meeting in real life. That kind of stuff just gets shut down and banned. Even the group that invited me to go to their parties had to be incredibly careful, and the group orchestrators were constantly paranoid that they would get the authorities called on them because they were in public hotels. And even though they weren't running any sort of prostitution ring, they were very aware that they could get busted for some sort of sex ring, even though everyone involved was a consenting adult and was there voluntarily. They were very, very aware that anyone, could very likely call someone and complain, and they could get disbanded and potentially charged with some sort of sex crime. So that was one of the reasons that when I was doing some research on this topic, when the phrase clubs or sex clubs came up, I was still surprised. Because as far as I know, and as far as I'm concerned, with my experience and what I know, especially my former work as a stripper, this type of thing is still incredibly heavily policed. Literally. The clubs that I used to dance in Los Angeles would get raided by the cops on a regular basis. And I knew girls that had been arrested and hauled out on the street in lingerie and handcuffs. But apparently, depending on where you go and depending on what country you're in, and even in the U.S. on occasion, I suppose there can be clubs that are legally sanctioned for this type of activity. It might be because they don't provide any people for sexual activity. They're only providing the venue. That might be how it's legal. They're only providing the space. I also found some information saying that there are chat groups that discuss and guide and orchestrate these type of events. I'm not sure exactly where those chat groups exist, but I think if you really just chase whatever's popular at the moment, they're going to exist anywhere. Everything is really just a recycling of what was original. So every time I see a new chat platform like Slack or Discord or even Facebook groups, it's all just a recycled version of what we had when the internet was new. Does anyone remember the original AOL chat rooms? Yeah, it all just looks like a different version of that. And then AOL Instant Messenger was just a better version of that. And then all the other messaging services were just slightly better versions of that. And now all of these other offshoot messaging platforms are just more specialized versions of what is just basic instant messaging. It's just more specialized. And now we can make everything more specialized for our likes and dislikes so we can isolate our groups. If I had to put money on something, I would be willing to bet that you could find something on Slack, Discord, Facebook groups, and any other platform that you prefer. You might be able to find specialized groups for something like this. And then apparently there are websites that are dedicated to this lifestyle. I would expect websites like this, again, to be heavily policed and ultimately shut down. Maybe that's just me and my experience in sex work or just my jaded, cynical brain. There was a sex party that got planned in my local area that was supposed to take place in a hotel ballroom. It got so big that it was covered by the local news, which then caused it to be protested, and it was ultimately shut down. So again, I'm always kind of surprised when stuff like this survives for lengthy periods of time because there's always an anti-movement against it. But apparently there's a website called FetLife.com, and right on the front page it says, FetLife is the social network for the BDSM, fetish, and kinky community. and it describes itself as being like Facebook, but run by kinksters like you and me. We think it is more fun that way, don't you? And there's a big red button that says Join FetLife. So you can't even look at this website unless you join. I guess Facebook is kind of like that too. You can't see anything in Facebook if you're accidentally logged out, but nobody knows because you're constantly logged into Facebook all the time. And that's part of the brain conditioning. There's a ticker at the bottom of FetLife that says that there are 9.8 million members. It's 13 years old. Oh, and it's based out of Canada. So that says something potentially for regulation benefits. I feel like it might go without saying that the U.S. is extra Puritan and anti-sexual freedom, so it may help that it's not based in the U.S. It's very clear that it's not a dating site. It doesn't present itself as a dating site. It doesn't appear to be one, and I don't think it could be confused as a dating site, period. Unfortunately, I don't have many more resources than that if you want to find these types of events or get involved in them. I think one of the challenges in this world of sex parties and people who either want to go to them or want to host them, or the groups of people who want to continue hosting them, is they still feel that they're being judged for them. Or a lot of people fear their anonymity or their identity. They fear their information getting out, even if they've been to them lots and lots of times. And then, like I said, the orchestrators of these events still have a fear of legalities getting involved, because many areas, especially even in places like the US, they still prosecute and punish orchestrators and sometimes participants in events like this, even if everybody is legal and on board with what's going on. So those are just a few reasons that some of these events are very, very hard to get information on. It's not just because people don't want anyone to know what's going on and they want to keep them exclusive. A lot of these orchestrators want new participants. They want new people to get involved. A lot of these parties have a hard time finding new people to bring in, and they want you to find them. But there are a few security issues, usually with the authorities, with whatever local legalities they're dealing with. And sometimes there's a security issue with people who are predatory. Sometimes burying the information about these parties is a built-in vetting system. So if you really want to go to them, you have to do some of the legwork to be able to find the details. So if you really want to go, you're the one who has to dig 3-4 levels deep. And so if you did that much, that's you proving to them that you really want to go. So if you find them and if you show up, that's you at least showing the organizer, like, oh, this guy actually worked that hard to find us. So at least he wants to be here. So try. And then don't be creepy. And maybe we'll talk about that next. Some do's and don'ts.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hi, folks, and thanks for sticking with me here at the GSMC Sex Podcast. Today we are talking about sex parties and everything that they have to offer. In the first segment, we discussed what exactly they are. We covered some basic definitions and how you may find your local sex parties, because I guarantee you there's probably at least one. So next, let's cover some do's and don'ts, because I'm going to assume that you found a local sex party and you're planning on attending. And if you're going to go to one of those things, you really don't want to go in totally cold and unprepared. And even if you did want to do that, the organizers are going to try their damnedest to prevent that, because I also assure you that they have seen some stuff. So they are probably going to send you a list of do's and don'ts and tips and tricks and things that you should know beforehand. But even still, you should take it upon yourself to learn some things, or at the very least, keep listening to what I'm about to say. First and foremost, a big do is set your boundaries and expectations beforehand. This is for a few reasons, but it's mostly about your own sanity and self-preservation. You have to set your own boundaries so that you are safe and you can properly inform the people that you are about to communicate with. If you sit down with someone and start to talk to them and they start to ask about your boundaries, if you're unable to answer those questions, you may confuse them and you may end up in a situation that you're uncomfortable with. If you don't set your expectations in a realistic zone, you may show up at the event and feel very uncomfortable because you don't know what you want, and you may leave the event feeling, again, very uncomfortable or even upset because you don't really know what you came for and you don't really understand what you got or if you even enjoyed it. So try to be very purposeful in where your boundaries lie and also what you want out of the experience. If you want to ask some questions about what type of event you are going to, you may be able to ask some clarifying questions of the organizers. They won't be able to get very specific about who you are going to meet, and they won't be able to make you any promises. But the organizers will know better than anybody about the general types of folks that their event tends to attract, especially if this is a repeat event, which many of these events are. Another big do is respect the other people that are at the event. And this is often a hands-down non-negotiable, and if you don't do this, you will be ejected and blacklisted. It's just that simple. But what exactly does this mean in an event that is centralized around sexual activity? It means things like you need to ask permission before physically touching someone. It means do not shame anyone for pretty much anything that they're doing or anything that they tell you. Confidentiality is of top-tier importance all the time. If someone does not respect you or breaks any of the rules in terms of respect, don't retaliate. Simply report them to the organizers. And try to do it discreetly, not in order to do anybody any favors, but mostly so that the organizers can take care of it swiftly. Another thing that I guarantee you is that most organizers of events like this have seen that type of thing before, so hopefully, in most cases, they can take care of that thing quickly and efficiently because they've done it before. If you have a problem of someone not respecting you at an event like this, and then you report it and then nothing is done, oh my God, don't go back to that event. Just don't do it. Here's another do. Do say no if you don't want to do something. Because unlike regular social interactions or regular dating interactions, the type of language that's used at parties like this is much more direct and to the point and sexually overt. It can still be respectful, and people are respectful in their approach and their language, but it certainly is more overt and direct. That being said, if you don't want to do what someone is proposing, if you don't want to participate in the thing that someone is suggesting, you are absolutely 100% within your right to say, no, thank you, that doesn't interest me. They are within their right to propose it to you, and you're within your right to say no. Where that interaction can get out of hand and where you should feel within your right to then say something to another party is if the person keeps pressing you and potentially harassing you after you've said no. and possibly said no multiple times. Do bring your own paraphernalia. Some of these parties provide protection, but only on a very basic level, like condoms only. And sometimes that's it. Sometimes I think they don't even do that because the organizers sometimes try to spend as little as possible. That's where money sometimes comes into play. On occasion, not all the time, and I can't speak for any of these organizers, but sometimes there is a buy-in to attend these parties. And the biggest reason that that's a thing is because sometimes the organizers supply supplies, such as barrier methods, like condoms. Other times I've seen things like refreshments, like sodas and snacks. But on a basic level, assume that there's going to be nothing, and I would bring your own. You can bring things like lube, toys, outfits. This is especially important if you have any sort of allergy or sensitivity. There's an awful lot of people out there that are allergic to things like latex. They're allergic to things like silicone. So, especially if you are one of those people that has some sort of sensitivity, just bring whatever you want to use, and then you'll have it with you. Put a tag on it with your name on it so you know it's yours. Not literally, you don't have to do that. I don't know, that might be weird. Do whatever you want. Do talk to people. This might go without saying, but the folks that attend these parties are pretty outgoing and very friendly. So when you get there will be people who want to chat with you. And you can chat back, and you can talk about sex, you can talk about sports, you can talk about anything. But people will want to talk about intimate stuff, and eventually they'll ask if you want to get involved in things if they're interested. And you can talk about that too. You can broach the subject too. But in general, there's a lot of chit-chat going on. If you want to break the ice by just sitting down and getting to know somebody, feel free to do that. That's fine. Don't overly pressure yourself by thinking that you have to do something else. It's fine if you just grab a soda, sit down, and talk to somebody about sports or this show that you're watching. That's okay. What if there is some intimate stuff going on that you do want to get involved in? Ask to join in. This happens a lot at these parties, where there's some intimate stuff going on between maybe two people, maybe just one person, and there are some observers. Maybe it's more, maybe there's three people. And let's say you're on the sidelines and you're thinking, I think I want to get involved in this. You just have to ask. You're allowed to ask. But just remember that they are also allowed to say no. And that's not the end-all be-all. That's just one person, one time. It's just one scenario also. So it doesn't mean that you can't stick around or keep watching or try again some other time. Every situation is vastly different. The important thing to remember is just to check first to see if you're on the same page as whoever else is involved. That's all. Even asking to watch sometimes is important. A lot of times what I observed was there was a common room, like a living room, in these suites. And the common room was sort of the neutral area where no intimate stuff really occurred. It was just sort of agreed upon as an unofficial rule that the intimate stuff didn't really occur in the common room. And then bedrooms is where the intimate stuff would go down. And the doors to the bedrooms were basically never closed. People could more or less float in and out of those areas as if they were common rooms, but they weren't. You could go in and out. They were just more separated from the common area so that people could have the illusion of privacy, but you could also leave there when you didn't really want to be a part of it anymore. And they weren't in full view of the entire party. People could go into those bedrooms while they were being used for the purpose of watching, but it seemed to be understood that if you did that, that you needed to do so essentially with the implied consent, which we talked about in the last episode, of the people who were already in there doing whatever they were doing. I was never in those rooms, so I'm not exactly sure how that all happened. Not to mention the fact that this is never going to be the same from event to event, bedroom to bedroom, party to party. it's going to be different every single time. And every single person's going to have a different method of communicating while they're in the middle of such a thing. So as long as you keep in mind that things like hovering is generally considered creepy and not acceptable in this type of environment, following a particular person or couple throughout the party, generally unacceptable and not okay. And if you ever get told, no, please don't do that, or please leave this room, rather than take it very personally, try to just follow somebody's instructions and find somebody else to talk to. As we've touched on in some prior topics, unfortunately, sexual topics tend to bruise the ego very easily. So if you do get any sort of redirection or a rejection, it's probably less about you and more about them and what they're doing, and that's all. And with that, we might be able to segue into some don'ts. Do not take photographs. Now that everybody has a camera on their phone, it is very accessible and very easy. At parties like this, strip club rules apply for photos. Do not take photos. Do not take videos. Unless there is some sort of very specific and explicit approval or instruction from a participating party to take a video or a photo, probably because it involves a kink of theirs, absolutely do not take out your phone to take photos or video of someone. I know I sound very serious about this, but people use fake names at these events because they're so concerned about anonymity. So even if you are taking pictures in the common area, not of a sex act, just because you think a lamp in the hotel room is cool, you may want to either check with people or just look around you to make sure you're not getting anybody's face, because you don't want to freak people out and make them think that you're careless or you don't know about this kind of stuff, because people are very concerned about their identity. Don't get wasted. There's alcohol at these events most of the time. Even though it's mostly BYOB, there's a lot of sharing, and even though it's BYOB, that doesn't mean you can't get wasted off the stuff that you brought for yourself. And that doesn't just mean liquor. People bring their own weed. People bring their own drugs. So you can't get out of hand at an event like this, because if you get out of hand with your substance, there's a good chance you might get out of hand with other guests. When I was still attending parties like this as a vendor, some of the more difficult conversations I've had with some attendees are the ones who were drinking a little too much and kept asking me repeatedly whether or not I wanted to get involved with some of the activities. And when people are drunk, they tend to repeat themselves a lot. So what they end up doing is asking over and over and over and over again, even after I've said no. And that's one of the cardinal rules of these parties, is if someone has said no to you, that you don't keep asking them. So if you get extra wasted at one of these parties and you, on purpose or otherwise, repeatedly break one of their cornerstone rules, you'll, again, get kicked out and blacklisted. So just don't overindulge. That leads me into what may sound like the same thing, which is don't press people or harass them. And I want to mention it outside of being intoxicated because many people will still do that when they're completely sober. I'm unsure if this is mostly a selfishness reason or a listening problem. I'm sure different people are motivated by different reasons. I attended maybe 15 of these swingers parties, and there was a handful of men who saw me multiple times, and a few of these men would ask me the same series of questions every single time they saw me. And one of those questions was, don't you want to get involved in this stuff? And my answer was no. Another one of those questions was, what kind of sex do you enjoy? And I didn't have a whole lot of answers, or my answer was a very generic vanilla sex, mostly to just kind of stopped talking about the topic because I didn't care to share that information with these people. Another question was, please tell me about the status of your relationship or how are things going with that guy that you told me you were with? Because they were essentially asking whether or not I was still in a relationship. And even though these questions don't seem very invasive, they become invasive when they're incredibly repetitious and they don't stop. And this was one of the reasons that I stopped going to the parties, is because my presence there became dominated by these types of conversations instead of me selling anything. No one was interested in anything that I was selling. Instead, they were completely interested in talking to me about my personal business and my relationship or my very, very specific sexual wants and needs. But if I didn't want to share any of that information, they didn't care what else I was there for, which was to sell things. So that also kind of adds insult to injury. Like, oh, so you're not interested in me unless I want to get naked, but you're especially disinterested in me for the real reason that I'm here. So I think I'm just not going to come back. But that was my experience attending these as a vendor, which is a bit unique. I believe anyone else would have a very different experience if they're attending as a guest on purpose, if you're looking to be there, wanting to participate for the purpose of the event in the first place. And if that's your goal, I'm going to get into a couple of the more nuanced tips and tricks and other questions that you may have now that we've covered a few of the basic do's and don'ts. And after we go over tips and tricks, I'm going to cover some sex party myths that you may still think are real. And they're definitely not.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, folks. This is Ainslie, and today we're talking about sex parties and everything you've ever wanted to know about them. We've already discussed what the heck they are and how you might find them, the basic do's and don'ts, which will hopefully keep you well-liked and well-protected if you attend one. And now let's go over some basic tips and tricks and some questions that you may have, some of which we may have touched on already, but let's get into some additional details. So you may be wondering, what's the tone of these things? So what should I wear? How do I show up? The parties that were being hosted by the group that invited me, they were being hosted in hotels. So everyone that attended was passing through a public hotel lobby, and they had to be pretty inconspicuous. So they were just wearing pretty normal clothing, and anything they wanted to change into, they either brought with them or wore underneath. That being said, if you have something that you want to wear, it should be pretty sensible and low impact. And just like anything that you're wearing for a partner, just be mindful of how functional and reasonable it is for a sex act. A lot of stuff during sex just comes off. Unless it's a personal preference of yours to wear something either for comfort or for a personal kink. There's a lot of outfits that you can just wear underneath your clothing. But if you don't want to, you can put it in a bag, a pocketbook, and bring that along with you. Be mindful of losing things. You really don't want to lose track of your stuff in a hotel room, especially if you're going to a large suite. Same thing with someone's house. If you're going to a home and you think you're going to lose track of things, you don't want to bring a lot of stuff with you. I almost never saw people bring bags into these events. People didn't bring a whole lot of personal effects with them. But if they did, they tried to keep it discreet and organized and minimal. I think sometimes these events ran themes to try to be fun and interesting. So if any of that has to do with what you're wearing, you can bring that if it lines up with whatever they're organizing. So if they have some sort of black theme or goth theme, or they're running a BDSM theme or something like that. Of course, you can do whatever the organizer prompts you to do, or do whatever you're comfortable with. This is just my uninformed speculation, but I would be willing to bet that if you went to an individual theme party that's run by a regular group, that the theme is probably not mandatory. But if you went to a standalone club that was running either a theme night or the club itself is a theme club, that might be mandatory. So if you run into some sort of theme, check if it's a requirement or not to get in, because sometimes it might be a non-negotiable. Let's talk about guys and girls. And I'm just someone who is speaking from observation, not from organizing, and I also happen to be a woman. I observed, but also heard directly from the organizers, that it was often tough for them to get women to attend. And it was almost unheard of for them to get women to show up individually alone, on their own. So they were always on the lookout for women to join new parties, new events that they were hosting. If I'm not mistaken, they would never charge women, and they would give preferential treatment to women, whether they were in a group, coming alone, which again, almost never happened, and if they were joining as a guest. So if you think about it, or when I think about it, that's basically how nightclubs work. Nightclubs are always jonesing for more girls to be inside. They let girls in either for free or at a discount. There's usually some sort of ladies promo going on, either on a certain day of the week or during a certain set of hours. Nightclubs hate letting in groups of dudes with no girls, or they won't let in groups of dudes with no girls, or they don't like letting in guys who are solo. That's another thing this group either wouldn't do or they had a max capacity on. They would only let in so many guys by themselves, and I think they wouldn't let in groups of guys, period. All of that is to say that both of these businesses are fighting this battle where the men are continuously outnumbering the women, and retention of the women on an equal level is perpetually challenging. Women have a lot of power in these situations. I once saw a woman walk into one of these parties, take a quick glance around, and she didn't say anything, but she must have decided that there was nothing there for her, and then she immediately turned on her heels and left. And most men that seem to attend the parties, they could rationalize that there was something there for them, and they would stick around, and they were willing to figure it out. So I can't say exactly what's going through everybody's minds in every scenario, but in general, there is a surplus of men, and they are continuously looking for more women to attend because the ratio is generally off. Based on what I saw, and also what I was told by the organizers of the series of parties that I was at, they didn't see a lot of single women. A lot of the women who were in attendance were part of a couple. They would turn down men, particularly if they were men who wanted to come alone. There was a certain capacity that they would reach. There were certain numbers that they had to play around with. So sometimes you have to either get in early or it's a good idea for you to bring a friend. Again, to use the nightclub analogy, there was more than once that my guy friends would shove me up to the front of the group because we were waiting in a line in a nightclub, and I was the only girl. People be playing those numbers. If you're concerned about safety, ask the organizers about what they have for safety precautions in their system, but also, speaking of friends that you're comfortable sharing these details of your life with, tell a friend where you're going. You don't have to be really detailed and explicit, but if you have an address, just tell them you're going on a date and give them the address. And if you want to, set up a time to do a safety call with them. It can be the next day. Or if you really want to, you can make it the night of and have it be one of those fake emergency calls if you think you're really going to want to get the heck out of there. But again, this is a very open and candid environment, and you are not going to have to make excuses to anybody at places like a sex party. If you don't want to be there, you can just say that and say, oh, this is my first time, and maybe I'm not ready, and maybe I'll just head out. In my experience, nobody is going to take that personally, think very deeply about it, and they'll probably forget about you entirely as soon as the door closes behind you. Because these parties get busy. Which brings me to another thing, that if you do stay at one of these parties and it's your first time, the traffic that goes through these spaces, it does get a little hectic sometimes, and it also changes very quickly. So if you do spend some time, especially in one place, be prepared for things to change around you very quickly. If you need to use one of the bathrooms, don't be surprised if you get a door knock a few times, especially if someone is in a rush because they just came out of doing something. The people who are there, they use the toilets a lot. They use the showers a lot. If you're planning on changing your clothes while you're there, you'll be around a variety of people who will have a variety of comfort levels regarding nudity. So if you shut yourself up in a room or a bathroom just to get dressed or get undressed or change your clothes, just know that someone else may not do that. If you have any questions about sexuality at these parties, generally the rules are that there are no hard and fast rules. I believe there's this attitude of all inclusive all the time, unless there's some sort of specialized group. And I would imagine to be able to find those types of things, you just need to go deeper into the recesses of things that we've already discussed. I have not, in my research thus far, nor in my exposure to the community, I have not run into any sort of this group of people is not welcome here. I haven't run into that. I haven't run into that officially, unofficially, of any kind. And without having witnessed very many of the sex acts at the events that I was at, I did meet many of the people who attended, and they were a wide variety of folks from many walks of life, and it's hard to say exactly how many boxes they all fit into. I would imagine the groups of people that are attending these things, if there's no screening process otherwise, I would imagine it's a fairly diverse crowd. Now, if you're looking for something more specialized, if you're looking for something that, let's say, a group that caters to a specific kink, then you might be able to find that, but you're probably going to have to drill down to exactly what kink are you looking for and search for someone that caters to that. Just know that that's when it gets harder. That's when it gets harder to especially find a group of people that gather for that kind of thing. Does that even occur in your area? Does that occur in your state? Just be aware that when you try to get that kind of information, that's why it gets more sparse. It's not necessarily about you being a weirdo. It's sometimes just about population and geography. So I was overcomplicating the question, but if the overarching question is, are these parties straight only? The answer is no. And I feel like that kind of leads into the question of, well, are they only for young, hot people? No, not at all. Not only do I feel like I saw a fairly wide range of ages, but I feel like I saw mostly average 30, 40-ish people. That could just be my area. Again, geography will heavily determine your experience, I feel. I saw an FAQ on some sort of list that said many of our participants are in their 20s and 30s, and that was just one group. I had a client at a strip club that I worked at in Los Angeles, and he was well into his 60s. He was married to a woman in her early 40s, and he was a frequent strip club visitor, and she was very aware that he went outside of their marriage, but only within certain parameters. He didn't have vaginal intercourse with any of the women that he came into contact with. He only did other things with them, and he had vaginal intercourse with his wife. That was an agreement that he had with his wife, and they were okay with that. And if they had gone to a sex party and had an agreement of, okay, we're each going to do what we're going to do with other people, but penetrative sex is off the table, you can do that. Anybody can do, again, you can make whatever choices you want, as long as it doesn't violate somebody else's body, somebody else's choices, as long as it doesn't violate someone else, period. And honestly, that's the kind of couple that you might see at a sex party. They have an agreement between themselves that there are certain parameters that are allowed in sexually going outside of their relationship, and they're both on the same page about it. And they will willingly go into an environment where they can explore those sexual boundaries, and then they'll reconvene, and then they'll go back home. And that's essentially what a sex party offers people like that. And I saw people in that age range, from mid-20s up into 40s, 50s. I'm not great at guessing, and not everyone shared their ages, but it ran the gamut. It did. Here's a small tip that I'm not sure everyone will agree on, and you may have to customize it for yourself, but don't flirt. And what I mean by that is don't flirt like you're in a bar, because you don't have to. This environment will be unlike anything else you've been exposed to in your life, and people will talk to you very, very honestly, maybe in a way that you've never seen before. So instead of letting it intimidate you, which may make you flirt harder, which is worse, let it make you flirt less and let it try to relax you. Because if you allow the environment to let your inhibitions drop a little bit instead of make you more nervous, it may help you acclimate more easily to what the whole party environment is meant to encourage. It reminds me of what Julia Roberts says to Richard Gere at the top of Pretty Woman when they first get into the hotel suite and he's giving her the strawberries and the champagne, and she's puzzled about the whole exchange, and she's kind of drinking it, but she's unsure, and she looks at him and she goes, "Let me give you a little tip. I'm a sure thing." What I'm getting at is that if you basically try too hard in an environment where people are there specifically for the purpose of having sex, you may alienate yourself even if you don't intend to, because this environment isn't for the purpose of you getting someone home. You're sort of already home. You're already in the place where the sex is meant to happen. So when you're talking to people, because this is not to say that you're not supposed to talk to people. What I hope I've communicated is that there's a lot of talking that will happen and should happen because it's a very friendly environment. You're meant to chit-chat. A lot of people want to chit-chat. People want to get to know you, and they like getting to know you. Talking is a huge part of foreplay. When I was still a sex worker and I was meeting people privately, there was more talking that happened than actual sexual activity. For a very long time, it's been spoken about that sex workers are really therapists in disguise. And these sex parties are sort of no different. People go there for human connection. It's not just about getting off. So you will talk to people, but the purpose of flirting is to try to hook somebody, and there really doesn't need to be any of that at these parties. You can go, be authentic, talk to somebody. It's one of the reasons that I mentioned talking to them about a show or a movie that you watched, or talking to them about sports. You can just be yourself, and you don't have to worry about running game. And then if there's this authentic sexual interest also, that's the bonus that everyone's looking for. And then you can pull the trigger on that too. And that's what you're there for. We're going to wrap up next with some myths that you still might be thinking about these sex parties. And we're going to bust those, because we are mythbusters around here.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking around for the last segment of the GSMC Sex Podcast, where we are talking about sex parties. I'm wrapping up this hour talking about the myths that you might still believe about sex parties, even though I have talked for the last 45-ish minutes about these things. And, I would think that I'd set you straight about a lot of details, but you just never know. So, what do you still believe about these things that just isn't true? Huh? Is it that everyone that goes to these parties is dirty? Well, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean that everyone has an STD because they're having a lot of sex? Well, that's just not true. That's just not. It does seem to be true that most, if not all, again, I'm not the super expert on all of these organizations across the globe, but most of them don't seem to require any sort of advanced screening or proof of any advanced screening. But to be fair, they're usually run by individuals, and the people that do run them seem to try to provide things like barrier methods. They also do a lot to preach safety. They don't tolerate the attitude of lack of safety. So they can't force you to be safe, but they do speak a lot about safety practices. And they won't tolerate you being unsafe towards others if it's negligent. So there's that. If you mean that everyone who attends these things is sexually dirty, meaning that they do dirty, kinky things, well, I can't really speak on that, can I? Everyone is hot. We touched on this a little in the last segment. Everyone is young and hot and attractive. I mean, that's subjective, certainly. So we already disproved everyone is young. Not everyone that attends these things is young. On the topic of hotness, I can only speak on what I've witnessed. I don't think everyone is hot who has attended these things. They're normal, average people. They just are. If you are put off by the idea that if you go to one of these shindigs and you're somehow going to be the troll in the corner, I'll just tell you right now that you're wrong. You're wrong. I don't know what you look like, but that can't be true. It can't be true. You're just wrong. You're wrong. Every time I went to one of these events, it's just an average collection of average people, and that's just how it went. Another one, everyone is naked. Everyone's naked. The whole time, everyone's naked. That wasn't my experience. And again, the common area or living room in these hotel suites where these things were held, It was sort of treated exactly like that. It was treated like a living room. And occasionally there would be maybe a flash of nudity if someone really had to pass through there as a necessity. But generally, nudity and sex acts were predominantly kept to side rooms and bedrooms. And people kind of wanted it that way for convenience because that's where the bathrooms were anyway. Everyone has sex. Everyone. Every freaking person in the whole place, everyone has sex. Everyone. No. If you don't want to do something, you just don't do it. Remember that girl who I said walked in, turned on her heels, and walked right out? She just left. She didn't have sex. She didn't want to stay. What about me? I would set up a table of sex toys and stay there for hours, and I wouldn't have sex. I didn't want to. I got asked many, 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 many times, and I did not have sex. But more than that, I would watch people attend, and not just women who didn't want to. I would watch men come in, and they would socialize in the common area. And not even newcomers who just showed up and were like, I don't know about all this. I would watch repeat comers who knew other attendees, and they would be like, I'm just not in the mood tonight. And they would come in with a six-pack and socialize and talk to each other about, I don't know, nonsense, work stuff, what was going on in the world. I'm telling you, it's chit-chat. It's people filling their time. It's human connections. People make friends at these things. What's it like to have friends? There's sex the whole time. Everyone's having sex the whole time from beginning to end the whole time. If I'm late, then I missed all the sex. If I can't go because I'm late, I missed it. No. These parties are hours long. And one of the reasons is because people show up at different times and they leave at different times. People are constantly showing up and leaving. It was one of the reasons that I would stay there for so long. Is because I had lubricant and toys just out, and I would stay and see who wanted what. Nobody ever wanted anything, but that's beside the point. Parties go on for a long time for a reason. People would actually show up early, be disinterested, leave, and then come back to see if it was better. And then sometimes, because sex is a very strenuous activity, there are people who are there, have a sexual activity with each other, take a break, socialize for a while, and then different people show up, and then they do a different sexual activity with a different combination of people. It's really anything that works for you during the allotted time. And again, because we talked about uneven ratios, what I saw was the women being able to dictate this because it was about their comfort level. It was about what they had the energy for and what their wants and needs were. I do find that very beautiful indeed. If I get involved in the middle of something, I won't be able to stop and get up and leave if I want to. I'll be stuck there. Oh, no, you can get up and leave whenever you want. If anything, I'm not sure if anyone will even notice. I mean, that's not entirely true. I can't speak for what other people will pay attention to, but I definitely know that I witnessed singular people just wander away from sex rooms, all sweaty and out of breath, and they were like, oh, boy, it's crazy in there. And whatever they walked away from just continued on without them. And everything seemed fine. So if you need to excuse yourself from something that you're all set with, or you're just tired, or more likely tired and dehydrated, you can just excuse yourself. And everybody's sort of on the same page about it just being okay and being necessary, because that's the environment that you're in. Oh my God, I'm going to see somebody that I know, and then my face is going to be on the internet, and my life is going to be ruined and over. So we discussed photos already. We talked about the fact that organizers, at least in my research thus far, have a no photo, no video policy. Unless there's some sort of express, discussed consent, probably because it's a part of somebody's kink, these events seem to have a very explicit no photo, no video policy. As far as you running into people you know, there's a reason that some people travel some distances to go to events like this. When I was at these events as a vendor, I think I heard some people say that they would travel to make an effort to isolate themselves away from their communities. And that's just a choice you're going to have to make. When I was a stripper, I worked with girls who traveled hours outside of their towns to dance. And again, that's just a choice you need to make if you really believe that you might run into somebody who knows you. And this is not something that you're going to be able to screen ahead of time, not only because they will not provide you with a list, but also because the organizers often don't know the real names of anybody who's going to be there. But even if they did, they would never tell you the names. If you do see someone that you know, try not to panic. Because the truth is that you're both there, and it's likely that maybe you both saw each other. If you're confident that only you saw them and maybe they didn't see you, maybe your best option is to just step out. And if you want to continue exploring these events, maybe you just look for something that's further away from your area. If you did mutually see somebody that you know, and now you're positive that you both identified each other, try not to panic out of a place of shame, because that's usually where these feelings are coming from. And depending on what is going on in your life and who this person is, it may be more effective for you to speak to them before you leave this event, simply to address the fact that you did see each other and also confirm that you don't plan on speaking about it and perhaps that you plan on leaving now that you know that you're both there. Something like that can diffuse a situation like that very quickly, and possibly both parties can agree that this isn't an issue and it never needs to be spoken about. If this person isn't that type of person in your life, then maybe you just need to leave things unspoken, but potentially that can lead to something more damaging and more uncomfortable. If you can diffuse it in real time, sometimes that's all the better. This is all assuming that this is someone that you don't want to see at a party like this. Maybe you do want to see them. In that case, bring them a drink. I'm not kinky enough to go to one of these things. I don't have a kink, and I don't like kinky stuff, and I don't want to do any of that. You don't have to. You don't have to have any specific preferences or have a kink, and they're not BDSM by default. So just because you're not quote unquote kinky, it doesn't mean that you're excluded from a sex party. You just need to have an interest in the concept. If you have an interest in the idea of meeting new people, or you have a taste for voyeurism, or you have a taste for multiples, any of those ideas that play into the concept of what a sex party has to offer, it might be the place for you. It doesn't necessarily need to fall under some sort of kinky umbrella. There are just certain things that sex parties tap into for certain people, and maybe you're one of them. That's another reason that they're pretty low impact. There are people that go to one, have a few drinks, meet a few people, do nothing, and decide it's not for them. There are some people that go to a bunch of them, do nothing, and decide it's not for them. There are some people that go to a bunch of them and then finally get involved. There are some people that go to a bunch and do a lot of stuff and then stop going because they are done. Just like a lot of other things, there's no rules. I have to last the whole time. The party's like 6 hours. How am I going to last the whole time? That's crazy. Yeah, that can't possibly be true. Like I said, I was just a passive observer at most of these parties, and I didn't see most of the sex acts, but like, that's crazy. And that can't possibly be true. That's not true. That's just a self-imposed expectation that you're putting on yourself. And again, these parties are generally very lengthy, and there's a lot of foot traffic. And it's not just a single activity that's happening throughout the night. It's many different people, and it's many different cycles of people, and therefore it's many different cycles of activity that are happening. Apparently, some of these parties are known to have several hundred people at them. Not often, and some of these are in very specific areas of the country, mainly, I think, more metro areas. But again, these are events that can get very, very large. There is never any kind of expectation, especially on individual people, to perform at that type of level. So if you're imposing any sort of expectation like that on yourself, I don't want to sound mean or anything, but like, no one's thinking about you that much. Oh man, there's only going to be like one type of person there, and there's only going to be like one type of thing going on, and it's not even going to be worth it. Again, now you've just already made a bunch of decisions about things that aren't even real, and you're just being restrictive and pessimistic. And I'm an extremely pessimistic person. But if you've already decided the way things are going to be and the way things are, these are events that are different every single place that they are. And not only that, but they're very different every single time they occur. So you're going to run into something different every single time that you go to one of them. And that being said, the law of averages tells me that you're probably not going to have a perfect experience if you go to multiple events. But that's just the way things are, and at least that will just teach you more about yourself and your own likes and dislikes. Oh, they're not going to have the snacks that I like. Well, that's probably true. Hey folks, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and click that notification bell. Remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of your social networks. Just search for GSMC or me, Ainslie Caswell. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.